is Eva Petras. I'm a Hungarian historian. I work as a senior research fellow at the Committee of National Remembrance in Budapest. My research field covers mainly the history of the Catholic Church in the 20th century, with a specific interest in the state security observation of the Church during the communist regime. In this lecture, I will speak about the experience of totalitarianism and state socialism in Central and Eastern Europe. After the Second World War, Soviet Union maintained the military occupation in Central and Eastern Europe. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the United States and Great Britain sanctioned the status quo that had thus emerged, so the Soviet Union could establish a permanent presence in the region. Winston Churchill's claim of 1946 that an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent symbolized this status quo. The 8 East Central European countries, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Albania, however, had different cultural and historical backgrounds, so they could hardly be seen as members of a homogeneous historical region. Anyway, they became constituents of a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Western Europe, and shared a common historical experience of totalitarianism henceforward. In 1947, the Communist International Movement formed Cominform, which had the primary aim to bring the East Central European countries under Stalin's control. In its realization, local communist parties could rely on the Soviet Union and in most cases on Red Armies on their territories. The political transformation accelerated between 1947 and 1949 when the so-called Popular Front multi-party democracies of the region gave way to the communist seizure of power. With this, a new phase started when the political institutions, economies, and societies of these countries were transformed to realize the communist project designed by the Soviet Union. Isolation, autarky, repression, coercive organizations, militarization, and permanent preparation for a next war happened in the 1950s, in the worst Stalinist years, during the whole region. Multi-party political systems were replaced by single-party dictatorships in all the countries, and communist leaders copied the cult of personality of Joseph Stalin. Klement Gottwald in Czechoslovakia, Mátyás Rákosi in Hungary, György Dezs in Romania, Enver Hoxha in Albania, and even Josip Broz Tito in Yugoslavia, who realized Stalinism without Stalin after he defied the Kremlin, personified those communist leaders who tried to achieve the egalitarian, work-based, productivist new social order of communism in their countries. People's democracies had a limited political legitimacy, so they fought for this legitimacy through show trials of their political opponents, imagined or real, internal or external. In the atmosphere of Cold Wars, beside the fight for political legitimacy, there were serious economic problems and failures in the region. War left these countries devastated. Agriculture, industry, infrastructure alike suffered serious damages during the war. That's why the task of reconstruction was very important in the first years after the war. Since the Marshall Plan was refused in these countries and the political takeover accomplished, these countries of East Central Europe followed a Soviet pattern. To promote this, a new organization was established, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, shortly Comecon, in January 1949. But the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance wasn't an organization of equals. For example, those countries who fought on the side of the Nazi Germany in the Second World War had to pay reparation for the Soviet Union, and this reparation made a great burden on their economies. Then joint industrial and foreign economic companies were set up whose profit was exploited by the Soviets as well. So we can say that the economies of the East Central European states were exploited to speed up the recovery of the Soviet Union in the Stalinist era. To reach this aim, also the domestic economies of these countries were restructured on the Soviet model. They initiated a central economic planning. 3, 5, 7-year plans were introduced. But this type of economy could be work only on a nationalized economy. So first of all, industry, then agriculture, later banking sector, and also retail trade was nationalized. For example, by 1942, 97 to 100% of the heavy industry output came from the socialist sectors, which were nationalized previously, but also almost every retail trade transaction was made by nationalized enterprises. However, there were problems with this new trajectory. It was not a unanimous success story in these states, and resulting from the ideology of workerism, industrial labor became as a central tenet in the region. It means that the social vision of the communist state was a modernized industrial society where the central role was played by the working class. However, there was also a problem with this project, namely that the workers, the industrial workers, comprised only a minority in East Central Europe. In the Czech lands, which was the most industrially developed region of East Central Europe, only 38% of the population belonged to the working class. And in the southeastern periphery of the region, in Romania and Bulgaria, industrial communities were in fact only islands in economies dominated by small-scale agriculture. Despite these circumstances, the governments pursued rapid industrialization with a focus on a heavy industry. For example, the Hungarian Workers' Party initiated to build a so-called country of iron and steel, even though Hungary was an agrarian country and there were no iron ore deposits or coking coal deposits in the country. However, industrialization transformed the economy and also the urban networks of the region. New socialist cities like Nova Huta in Poland, Stalinváros in Hungary, or Dimitrovgrad in Bulgaria were established around heavy industry. They symbolize a kind of totalistic living and working environments where people who worked in the heavy industrial companies lived in the nearby housing estates. These socialist cities were models for socialist infrastructure and society, but first of all, they were means of a monumental ideological propaganda. They were called hero cities, where the workers were expected to increase productivity and accept the sacrifice for the building of socialism. Labor competitions and decoration of outstanding workers were organized. These outstanding workers were called Stakhanovites after Stakhanov, a Ukrainian coal miner of the 1930s, who made fantastic norms in his shifts. Anyway, these labor competitions didn't have a success among the people. There were working class cultures and also trade unionism in Central and Eastern Europe, and although they were suppressed by the communists, these new forms of workers' activism couldn't get well established. Whereas the nationalization of industry was carried out in a short period, the process of collectivization of agriculture, although it was by far the largest campaigns of the communist elites, could finish it, and even then there were certain setbacks and failures in it. However, the histories of agricultural development had highly differentiated patterns in the East Central European countries. There were countries like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, or Poland, where there were large estates before the Second World War, while in other countries, small-scale farming was typical. Already after the Second World War, during the Popular Front period, there were radical land reforms in these countries, and after that we can say that small-scale agriculture dominated the whole region. In those years, communist parties vocally supported private farming, but it changed dramatically after they seized the power. From that point, they contributed to realize the Soviet pattern of forced collectivization. Coercive, politically determined, inorganic and unprofessional measures were put into practice, which had huge economic and human price, which couldn't be overestimated. In the first steps, there were high increase in taxation for individual farmers. Then compulsory delivery obligation were increased, and later wealthier peasants were stigmatized as kulaks and as enemies of the villages. The collectivization campaigns, however, had certain national characteristics. It could have been a backspace in the more developed countries like in Hungary, Czechoslovakia or Poland. However, peasant delegations went to the Soviet Union to study the state farms, cooperatives and machine and tractor stations there. They were not convinced about the superiority of the Soviet agriculture. Consequently, a free decision to join collective farming would have hardly brought the expected results in the region. The first wave of the collectivization started at the end of the 1940s through the whole region of East Central Europe. It contained state agitation, propaganda, kulak lists, and state security actions. At the same time, it happened when the political power of the regimes was still being defined. That's why it had a great role in institutionalizing the regime's administrative and repressive practices as well. It was also instrumental for redefining relation between state and society. State penetrated into the life of the rural communities, institutionalized control over the production and the revenues of the people. However, it wasn't a success story. There were dramatic retreats from collectivization, for example, in Poland or Yugoslavia. Elsewhere, forced collectivization continued until the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, and by the end of this, peasantry was transformed from private owners to an underclass subordinated to industrial development. As we see, party apparatus was anxious to transform the economy and the society. However, they didn't stop at this point. They also wanted to transform nature. In this Promethean intention, they followed a Soviet pattern, Stalin's plan of nature transformation from 1948. Of course, there were nature transformation projects elsewhere in the world in the 20th century, but what happened in the Soviet Union was quite exceptional. According to the propaganda, nature should be subjected to socialist development. Dams, hydroelectric power stations and irrigation systems were constructed, and citrus and cotton cultures were planted even in those regions where soil and climate didn't support them. These were based on the pseudo-scientific notions of Trofim Lysenko, a Soviet scientist whose notions on agrobiology became dogmatic truth. Nature transformation was embraced also in East Central Europe, but of course on a smaller scale. For example, in Czechoslovakia, forest shelter belts, dams and hydroelectric power stations were constructed. In Hungary, experimental farms for Lysenko's study of new crops were established, and also new plants such as cotton, rice, rubber dandelion and citrus were planted. Hungary's climate, however, didn't support these plants. Also in Poland, they experimented with exotic fruits. There were purges at the academies of sciences. The newly organized Stalinist academies and the propaganda then proselytized the nature transformation notions and projects. In the Cold War atmosphere, the utopia of a socialist wonderland of plenty had, however, a certain social impact. In schools and among children, it was quite popular. They experimented with new crops, or they were recruited for fieldwork because some of these new plants needed a lot of manual labor. However, these experimentations were very costly and environmentally unsound, so they were abandoned later. Propaganda played a big role anyway in the everyday life of the people. In this sense, the communist parties were very good disciples of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Propaganda had a manifold task. They had to present the ideology to convince society to contribute to the consolidation of the regime. They also had to keep the society in fear of a real or potential enemy, to recognize them. And propaganda also wanted to make people engage in building a better tomorrow. Propaganda also had the function to defend socialist achievements, to glorify the communist leaders, and to disseminate ideology, because the Enlightenment and ideological education was very important to the regimes. By means of propaganda, societies were divided into supporters and enemies of socialism very easily. The range of enemies, however, was enormous. They comprised of the representatives of non-communist political forces, then kulaks when the forced collectivization of agriculture started. At the same time, church leaders and church members were also targeted, because the churches were the main ideological enemy of the socialist regimes. For example, in Hungary, 1,200,000 citizens were observed and discriminated by state security in the 1950s, who counted about half of the population of the country together with their family members. However, sometimes also senior communists fell victim to discrimination. For example, László Rajk, who was found guilty as a Titoist spy and executed in 1949, or Rudolf Slansky, former Secretary General of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, who was found guilty in treason and executed in 1952. To realize such kind of purges, there was a vast, effective, and very fearful state security system that was a fundamental part of the power system. Already after the World War, in the Popular Front period, communist state security was built parallel to the police forces, and the communists could use this state security after they seized the power. This state security system was dramatically expanded at the turn of the 1940s and in the beginning of the 1950s. In Hungary, the state security truly became, as they said, the fist of the proletariat. They were used in managing show trials. They operated internment and forced labor camps, imprisonment and law enforcement facilities. However, section of population still invested in non-communist identities, for example, those of religious character. Therefore, churches became primary enemies to the communist systems. In principle, the emerging people's democracies guaranteed religious freedom. In practice, however, the communist regimes preferred atheism and a kind of mistrust against the churches. In the Popular Front period, a separation of state and church happened in most of the countries of East Central Europe. However, when the communists seized the power, they saw churches as clerical reaction, as an obsolete power body with which they have to fight. Therefore, administrative measures were brought. They limited the church to the church services, withdraw the licenses of the religious orders, and sometimes even of churches, as for example in Romania, where the Greek Catholic Church was banned. Then religious education was first limited, then abolished in schools, and the whole church school system was nationalized. But first and foremost, land reform was partly against the churches, because they nationalized the church estates, and that's why the financial background of the churches were cracked. The persecution of the churches reached its peak when church leaders were arrested and condemned in show trials. This happened with József Mindszenty, Archbishop of Esztergom in Hungary, Alojzsius Stepinac, Archbishop of Zagreb in Yugoslavia, Joseph Beran, Archbishop of Prague in Czechoslovakia, Áron Márton, Bishop of Alba Iulia in Romania, Stefan Wyszynski, Archbishop of Gniezno and Warsaw in Poland. The expectation behind these anti-religious and anti-clerical measures was that in the long run the religiosity of the people would decrease and the churches would disappear. However, it didn't come true, although secularization process of course had its results. Therefore, the regimes had to find new strategies to fight with the churches afterwards. By the time of Stalin's death in March 1953, the communist regimes in the East Central European states were well established. These were totalitarian regimes. Using Hannah Arendt's definition on totalitarianism, it has general characteristics of having a closed exclusivist ideology, a single-party system, central direction and control of the economy through state planning, monopoly on culture and on means of communication, and an effective state security network infiltrating all segments of life. So the new regimes in the Eastern Central European countries fulfilled all these criteria. That's why they could be called totalitarians. A new course started in the Soviet Union, where the Soviet leaders admitted that it was a mistake to pursue accelerated implementation of socialism in East Central European states because of their objective preconditions. However, this de-Stalinization immediately weakened the local Stalinist leaders and caused a kind of de-Stalinization crisis when party leaders were removed and were blamed because of the crimes of Stalinism. The local communist parties also admitted that it was a mistake to copy Soviet policies slavishly. That's why they applied a kind of slight shift from the Soviet hegemony. And by the beginning of the 1960s, the idea of the distinctive roads to socialism was born. De-Stalinization, that's why, meant a kind of de-subtilization, which means that the satellite East Central European states wanted to loosen their ties with Moscow. Anyway, Moscow invariably determined what could happen in East Central Europe. If we compare the Stalinist period with de-Stalinization, we see that the megalomaniac heavy industrial investments were stopped and replaced by light industry. Forced collectivization campaigns were stopped and the temporal toleration of privately owned farms gained ground. Instead of cult of personality, a kind of collective leadership in the party started. In the de-Stalinization, the state security bodies were restricted to some extent, and instead of isolation between the Cold War camps, attempts were made to reduce international confrontations. However, the reforms didn't come in time. In some countries, there were unrest, as for example in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland and Hungary. The events turned critical after Nikita Khrushchev had his speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956. In his secret speech, Khrushchev admitted the crimes of the Stalinist era. It had an immediate impact on East Central Europe. Intellectuals appealed for freedom of speech and social reforms, and of course the communist apparatus was paralyzed. The shocking consequences became obvious in Poznań, Poland, where the workers went on strikes in June 1956. This strike was a spark that triggered an explosion. The protest spread through the city and resulted in the collapse of the Stalinist apparatus. It quickly gained a political and freedom-fighting dimension, which was eagerly watched elsewhere in the region, for example, in Hungary. In Hungary, demonstrations started on the 23rd of October 1956. These demonstrations of the university students, young workers, generated an uprising which caused almost a total collapse of the communist state in a couple of days. National committees, workers' councils, political parties were established, while the Hungarian Workers' Party was disbanded. A senior communist, Imre Nagy, was appointed as prime minister with a popular front attitude, but in the accelerating domestic and international crisis, his efforts were useless. He announced free elections and a multi-party system in Hungary, and also Hungary's neutrality. But of course, the Soviet Union couldn't tolerate such kind of efforts. That's why a Soviet military intervention happened on the 4th of November 1956, which suppressed the freedom fight of the Hungarian nation. The consequences of the uprisings were the reprisals and disappointment over the whole region, which followed the restoration of the communist regimes. In Hungary, János Kádár, a collaborationist communist, became the prime minister and the leader of the newly founded Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party. In the first years of his reign, he governed by martial law, and of course the state security's rule was restored. Imre Nagy was executed. Later, a kind of moderate compromise happened, which was based on a social amnesia, where the revolution of 1956 played the role of a systemic taboo. There was a general disappointment in Poland after the uprisings. Stagnation and political orthodoxy characterized the country. Military considerations played a central role in the 1950s and 1960s. Warsaw Pact had been established in 1955 to build a military security system for the Soviet Union and East Central European regimes. It had the striking feature that the initiative remained always with the Soviet Union in this period of de-Stalinization. It happened also in case of East Germany, which had a unique position in the Eastern Bloc. The German policy of the Soviet Union was characterized by ambivalent features. The Soviet Union made obstacles in Western Germany's integration into Western allied systems, while GDR became the most faithful client of the Soviet Union. In this policy, the existence of West Berlin was a system anomaly, which should be changed. It was done by building the Berlin Wall in 1961, which closed the escape routes of the East German citizens to the West, stabilized the East German communist regime, and became the symbol of both the division of Germany and the bipolar world order. However, the limits of the elbow room for the East Central European countries were most consequentially demonstrated by the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. After years of stagnation, there was experimentation with democratization in the second half of the 1960s in Czechoslovakia. Reformist tendencies became popular, which was too much for the Soviet Union. So a military intervention happened by the Soviet Union and by other East Central European countries to suppress this initiative. If we want to draw a conclusion of the de-Stalinization period, we can say that by the end of the 1960s, the socialist rule was largely consolidated in most countries. In the East-West relations, non-interference prevailed, which shed light on the limits of détente. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia, there was no hope for change, because any change could come only from Moscow. Nevertheless, communist parties and rulers recognized the need for normalization in the 1970s. In Hungary, efforts concentrated on economy because increasing living standards contributed to the stabilization of Kádár's rule. By the 1960s, a kind of socialist consumerism appeared in Hungary and also in Yugoslavia. Consumer societies were based on expressing self-identity and social difference by these goods, by dress, by cars, by weekend plots, which gained an increasing importance. This process may resemble the transformation of the working class in the West, but it happened later and under different circumstances. Housing also underwent changes. It improved in quality and quantity as well. In the 1950s, there were housing shortages in the region. It became a central issue. State subsidies helped those who wanted to buy new houses. To meet the demands, housing estates were built. For example, Hungary purchased a license from the Soviet Union in 1962 to build mass-produced, prefabricated concrete panel housing estates. New village houses types emerged, a kind of cube houses were built. However, a kind of modernization started. Electricity, clean water, sanitation, plumbing systems improved the comfort of these houses. In the 1970s and 1980s, Hungary was said to be the happiest country in the Soviet bloc. A kind of goulash communism was realized here, but the economy didn't support it, so the state became indebted and economic reforms were needed. Czechoslovakia also needed economic reforms, but in both countries they were stopped, and the emphasis was laid again on ideological orthodoxy, even in economic matters. We see a stagnation of socialism over East Central Europe in the 1970s. The communist utopia was reduced to actually existing socialism. In these circumstances, opposition began to grow. There was a growing strive for self-determination in these movements. The opposition movements had a kind of echo effect in the region. This means that if an opposition movement was successful in one country, it had good resonance in another country. This happened, for example, in connection with Czechoslovakia and Hungary. With the case of Charter 77, Hungarian intellectual greeted and joined the Charter 77, which this way gave a momentum to their movement. Also, events in Poland had a resonance over the whole East Central European region. When the Archbishop of Krakow, Károly Wojtyła, became Pope John Paul II in 1978, this fact gave hope to all people in the region. His visit to Poland in 1979 was a turning point because it opened a new public space independent of the party, on which opposition could grow. Next year, the Solidarity movement was born. Through military and economic crisis, Poland reached the round table talks and showed how to negotiate freedom for the East Central European states. Of course, opposition movement couldn't be successful without events in the Soviet Union. After the election of Mikhail Gorbachev as the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985, reforms and changes started there. Gorbachev also reconsidered Soviet foreign policy, and when he declared non-intervention in the decision of the East Central European countries and free choice in choosing their political forms, it contributed to the sudden collapse of these regimes. 1989 was Annus Mirabilis, a year of the wonders in the East Central European countries, because it witnessed the collapse of communist regimes with an unexpected ease and suddenness. There was no scenario for dismantling the communist systems and for democratic transition, however. These revolutions were negotiated revolutions. They were called velvet and peaceful ones, and they wanted to emphasize the non-violent transition to the rule of law. It was best symbolized by the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, which symbolized the end of an era, the era of the communist totalitarian regimes in East Central Europe.